Welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Kathryn Pedersen here today with Michael Regan. And today we're going to go through another coaching topic, but this one's going to be a little bit more broad than what we normally do. And why is we kind of thought, well, we talk really in depth on so many different business coaching topics. So, diving into the business plan, diving into the business vision, but we want to kind of go up and look at it from higher up and say, hey, here's kind of the main framework of the business building foundation and how they all tie in together. So we thought that would be a great thing to do. I actually felt some urgency around this. So hence we're doing this today to get this out. And with that, I'm going to bring in Michael. Thanks for being here.
Well, always happy to record with you, Kathryn. These are really fun. I'm still having just as much fun 2.5 years in as when we kicked off. And you're right. This is probably a topic that we've talked so much about over the last 2.5 years that I don't realize that we haven't intentionally framed it. So maybe what will separate in this episode is strategy from tactics, because a lot of what maybe we've covered in previous episodes are the tactical application of business vision and business planning and some of the other ancillary pieces of that. But I think you're right. As we pull up to that higher level view, we can look at more of the strategic intention behind those, and not just how these exercises are designed, but the why behind how they work together, how they're designed to flow, how they're designed to create the stability that I think any business operator needs. So whether you're a small business owner, whether you operate like an entrepreneur within an organization, don't get confused by how the IRS collects taxes, W-2 or 1099. Be more thoughtful of if you have that ownership mindset. If that's the way you operate, then I think you're going to get a lot of value out of us breaking these down today. So I'm glad you brought this back into the forefront of our conversation, Kathryn.
Yeah, and I'm hoping people will take some of those episodes that we have on each of the details and kind of take this and say, okay, here's the basic structure. And now let me dive in as I kind of get to know each one of these topics. So let's dive into the first one, which is vision. So let's talk through that and kind of why is that first?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, because you could make the argument that if we were, building the foundation of a house and you've got these four corners, well, why do you pick the northwest corner before the northeast or the southeast or the southwest? Well, in this case, it actually does matter, because vision, by definition, is our ability to look out into a future state and see clearly something that attracts other people to invest time and energy and effort toward what we've described for them. And so this is a key ingredient for a leader. So let's use the scenario of if you're launching a business or if you're building a team within your business, your ability to attract people to join you, whether they're going to be teammates, whether they're going to be service providers, or whether they're going to be customers, is really rooted in your ability to cast vision. If you're not able to give people a sense of who you are and what you're doing and why that matters so much, and how they might be involved if they wanted to be, if they can't see that clearly, it's a fast-paced world out there. People just, they'll miss it. And they'll miss it not because they don't like you or not because they don't care about maybe what you could offer them. They'll miss it because you didn't articulate a vision that was so compelling that they started to insert themselves into it in their mind. They started thinking, oh, how could I be a part of that? How could I participate in that? And I think that's why it's so important. And that's why we start there, Kathryn, because if I can help a leader get clear on those core ingredients, so let's repeat them, the really clear statements of who they are, a really clear statement of what they're trying to do, a really clear statement of why that matters so much, a really clear statement around how that's just a little bit different than any other service provider that you might assume is doing the same thing, and then create a sense of action around it. Like, okay, great. If that's what's going to happen, how are we going to move into a future to where we might be able to measure some of the success of that if we were to move forward? And so you have to come up with what sometimes are called BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goals, or WIGs, I think, in the 4 disciplines of execution. Those are the wildly important goals. These are just names around the piece of the vision that lets people know we're going to do big things and we want you to be a part of it. So I could probably rattle on this one alone all day, Kathryn, but that's why we start there because it sets the compass in the true direction that we want to head.
And I always think about starting at the end. So this is similar to, let's jump to the life plan, which we're not talking about today, but you kind of start at the end where you do like a eulogy of yourself. And so it's kind of that same thing of what do things look like out here? And you can't figure out the Google Map directions until you know the destination. And so that's one thing why I always think it seems opposite to start at the end, but it actually makes the most sense because it gets you really clear on what you want. And there's no way to write a plan unless you know what you want at the end of the day.
It's a great example that you give because most of our audience can understand this. If we maybe step outside of your business for a moment, you used a life plan as a visual for this, but lots of us use vision in practical ways all the time. You know, you've got two daughters, one already in college, one who's just getting ready to start college. There's probably a vision in each of their minds about the adult they want to become. Whether that's a professional person in a very specific area of work that has a very, I don't know, important area of time being spent to them, meaning it's something they care a lot about. They want to learn about it because they want to spend time there. Well, all those things are components of vision. They involve who they are. They involve what they want. They're clear on why they want it. They even have a sense of how to go after it. So part of the begin with the end is they know, well, in order to maybe progress in that future, I might need a degree. So that starts to shape the steps working backwards. Well, if I need a degree, it needs to be from a school that's really renowned in that degree. Okay, well, that's going to start to narrow the focus. And at some point you get back to simple things like, you know, the test scores that are needed or the qualifications that are needed. But all of those began with a vision of why are we doing this? Most people go into college with that vision. Not true. This is also a good example. Some people go to college and change their mind about what they want to do. And that happens, I think, in business as well, but much easier to redirect a vision that already exists toward, as new information comes, toward a different outcome than to find yourself feeling like I'm starting at zero every time something changes. That's a much harder position to be in. And as you progress in your age, you know, as the decades start stacking, this is where I think people feel stuck. Like I spent my whole life climbing some ladder only to find out it was leaning against a wall I don't really care about. It's super important to have that vision as a young person. So that's an area of life we have it. I mean, I could give you all kinds of illustrations. Hopefully that's what people think about when they get engaged to get married. Hopefully they have a vision of what living with this person for the rest of my life looks like, and on and on. It's such a key ingredient. And I think in business, when we do this, it's a differentiator because you do start to stand out if you're a leader who speaks in the tone of vision, because people start to be drawn to this idea of, okay, Kathryn talks about a future that I didn't even know anything about. Now I'm curious. I want to, it elevates your status in their eyes. They want to maybe spend more time with you. I certainly learned that listening to Daniel Harkavy 25 years ago, and found him to be extremely compelling at events like Sales Mastery because he would stand on stage and talk about vision in a way that most people just didn't talk about. And it helped him stand out. So yeah, you gave a great example with the life plan. It's probably why in the episode we had with Greg Harkavy, we talked about why it's such a critical step in the business planning process, because you start to practice these skills with things you really care about, and then they transfer really smoothly when we want to talk about business topics. So I think we're already off on the right foot.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk through that second one now, which is plan. So I know that that word is so quick and simple, but there's a lot involved in that. So can you break down plan and what you mean by that here?
Yeah, well, we definitely have had an episode where we've talked a lot about the way in which I'll at least provide direction on planning. And planning for me involves a combination of several key ingredients. We have to have some outcomes, and I prefer SMART goals. That's just my bent. I like things to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time based. So we've talked about that previously. And so if you're listening to this episode and hadn't maybe heard that before, great opportunity, as Kathryn said, go back and review a previous episode around the specific elements of planning. But we've got to start with outcomes. And once we've got outcomes that fit that SMART goal criteria, you can look pretty quickly at two other categories. You're either going to have certain disciplines, which are the repeated activities that are likely to drive that outcome, or you're going to have projects, which are the improvements you're going to make that have a very specific due date toward achieving those outcomes. And we could break those down a little further, but I almost want to back up a step if I could. Again, keep this thing kind of high level. So, what's the difference between a vision and a plan? Because sometimes those terms in certain organizations get used very interchangeably and they could be confusing to someone. And I'll use this description to see if this helps. A vision is going to be that view of the future. The plan is going to be the tactical execution. So, you might say, a vision without a plan is like a dream. You're just dreaming about something.
Mm.
You don't have any plan to actually do it. So if you've met people that are really great visionaries, but they're not great planners, they tend to be, we call them dreamers. They're always, oh, they've got some amazing idea that really never happens. And so a vision without a plan is like a dream. But I'd flip those around and say the inverse is true as well. Some of us are excellent at creating and driving a plan, but if you're planning without a vision, it's more like a nightmare because you spend all of your time working toward outcomes that aren't intentional. They're just random. They're just you're just punching down to-do lists with no real thought of how do these things ever work toward a better version of me or a better version of the people around me or a better version of the team I'm building or the organization that I'm working with. So in my mind, they're tied at the hip. I mean, these things are tethered intentionally because I don't, a vision without a plan might be a dream. A plan without a vision might be a nightmare. I'd rather combine them and design something really beautiful that not only people can see, but then we're going to step into it and say, and now here's what we're going to do toward that future that we see. So I hope that helps looking at it at a much higher level view of why
Mhm.
these are so unique and why they're both so important.
Okay, so leading on that same theme is the next one playbook, because I think playbook and plan talk about getting confusing. I think those two can be very hard to distinguish. So let's start with that and we can dive into playbook a little bit more.
I'm so glad you draw the distinction, or you at least point out that we need a distinction because you're right. I think at first glance, they are close in their structure, but here's the differentiation and why one becomes so critical as time goes on. When you're first getting started in your career, you're learning skills that you're developing talent around, and at some point people will start acknowledging that, like, Kathryn, you're really good with numbers, or Kathryn, you're really good with people, or whatever the case might be. You've got these skills, and as they develop, some of them could be natural. You might have been born with certain skills. Others might have been learned over time because you got influenced by the people you spent time with, the books you read, the impact of others around you. But no matter where those came from, once they're in play and you're starting to design plans toward the vision you have, at some point you start to develop standards. You start to develop best practices. You start to develop a process, maybe even in some cases a true system. And so documenting that learning allows you to build an even stronger foundation to build from going forward. In other words, you don't have to keep repeating the same plan over and over again. You don't have to keep repeating the same experiences over and over again. You can build on them. And some folks are really good about designing the playbook so that they are creating the roadmap that others can now follow them and do the same. That's really the differentiation. So yes, the plan might have some similarities to the playbook in its genesis, but as you move over a period of time, you're starting to inform into those plans the things that consistently work versus the things that might work one time and we're never going to do that again. the things that consistently work, and I think you and I see this in the housing industry all the time. I mean, last I checked, if you're a real estate professional or a lender, reaching out to your past clients is always a good idea. It's always a good idea. How we do that, the techniques, they may change a little bit over time, but your playbook will be the reflection of a plan in which you proved that those things were effective and they continue to be effective. So they become part of your process. They become part of the standard that you create. And at some point, you want to capture those in a playbook so you can build on those. You can hire now and train people toward those more quickly rather than everything just being a verbal transfer of information. You've actually got a playbook that says, we've kind of figured out how to do this. This works really well. It's not 100% airtight, but it's probably in the 90th percentile of when we do this, we can count on it. So the playbook becomes so much more effective to elevating future plans. We can now plan toward more complex things in the future or more important things in the future because we've got that playbook that really defines our standards. Does that help?
Yeah. And I think I'm continuing to think through it as we're talking. And I think the way that I envisioned it was, hey, if a plan might change all the time, but that playbook will slowly change. But a lot of it's like, hey, every time someone comes on, here's the 50 things we're going to train them on. So some of that may not change as often as your plan because that might be changing quarterly as things adjust. So that at least was in my brain about that playbook is kind of like a template. It's a little bit of a processes. It's that just day to day stuff versus you might stretch that plan a little bit and say, hey, let's add a new process. Let's add a new this, or let's adjust how we do that versus that plan is a little bit more like in pen.
You're totally catching it because take what you just said and play that out. As you now try that new process and you're testing that new system and it becomes normal, it might eventually get built into your playbook for future knowledge because now you've
Mhm.
learned, oh, we learned a better way to do this. We learned a different way that is maybe more in alignment with our partner or our customer. We made it easier for them, so they liked it more. And so we upgraded our playbook. But you're right, your playbook is going to only evolve as your plans and your execution have proven that that's reliable. Like if we consistently do that, we can trust in the outcomes that are going to come from that. And so you capture it. I think you've got the spirit of it exactly right. And so hopefully most of us that design plans could maybe look back at those plans over time and realize the guts of our playbook already exist. We just need to capture it. And that could be an opportunity for someone listening today.
Yeah, one thing that immediately comes to mind is someone says, hey, I want to start doing annual reviews. Well, great. You put the system in place, you put in the touch points, you get this done, you get the systems, and then it goes into your playbook once that's done. Because you're not going to have do annual reviews. That's become a habit. You now have that in your playbook that every single time you're doing the 3 month, 6 month, 12-month annual review call, da, da, da. So it becomes part of the traditional playbook after it was a project in your business plan.
Again, I think you captured it perfectly. That's exactly the spirit of it. So I hope people maybe take from that, you know, you've really got to put some thought into the plan as you created of how can I elevate my plan over previous plans because that informed learning got captured in my playbook. That's now standardized. So we have that. How can I now stretch and grow? Because, there's an adage in business that if you're not growing, you're dying. And while that may sound dramatic, the idea is we live in a world in which the proliferation of information is at an incredible pace. I mean, we live in an AI world now. It's no longer the future. The future is now. We're living in it. And so if we're not regularly asking ourselves, is there a new way? Is there a better way? The risk is we get stuck in a way that just gets smaller and smaller, and our audience gets smaller and smaller, and pretty soon we lose some of our relevance. So
Mm.
my hope is this is exciting someone to take the examples you're catching and start putting them into action in your plan and in your playbook.
Good. All right. Well, there's one more. And I think this is the most difficult one, I think. So the last one is scorecard. So let's describe that and explain what that looks like.
Well, most of us look at scorecards through outcomes in terms of bottom line results. So if you manage a P&L, your P&L is a type of scorecard. It's going to tell us the financial results of everything you're managing. So the inflows and the outflows, all the things that are embedded in that financial statement are ultimately calculated, and we either see a profit or a loss. And as we do, we can see the details of where within the cash flow of our operation we are making money or spending money, and the impact of both of those on the net profit or the lack thereof. So it's a type of scorecard. And so we already have that in most of our operations. That's not new to anyone. So I encourage folks to make meaningful scorecards out of some of the things that aren't as typical in their organization. So again, to be clear, a P&L is critical. We definitely, I mean, we're not doing this for not-for-profit voluntary purposes. We do need to have, financial acumen over running our business, but we also can scorecard things like our leading indicators, which would be things like the efforts we make. So go back to the plan, and I described the difference between disciplines and projects. Think about all those disciplines, those activities that you commit to do repeatedly to drive the outcome that's in that plan. Well, you can scorecard those activities to start to determine a couple of things that you can learn once those scorecard results start tallying. You start to learn either how consistent you are with the disciplines that you committed to. That can teach you a lot about your focus, your fortitude, your ability to fight through the adversity of a lot of rejection or no's, because that happens in a sales-oriented profession. But it can also inform you when you look at some of the data as it relates to pull through. How many calls am I making that result in quality conversations, or that result in live meetings, or that result in action being taken by my consumer? Well, that scorecard can inform a lot about the quality of your effort. Because if you're losing a lot of people between these outbound calls and quality conversations, maybe something that is happening in that quality conversation deserves to be reviewed, because that might be an indicator that, gosh, I'm getting a lot of people interested in taking my calls, but then they're not interested in moving forward after we have what I think is that quality conversation. And depending on the profession you're in, that could be, if we're in the housing industry, so here'd be the example we'd come up with. If you're a real estate agent, that quality conversation might be the appointment you want to schedule around doing a review of their property and providing some sort of proposal around where their property value might fit within other properties that are similar, how you might market that property, the types of people that might be interested in it, the strategy you might, well, all those things are part of a really great quality conversation and a proposal. And if you're not getting people to take action on that, how are you going to really know where that missing information exists unless you're scorecarding it? Because if you're like me, most folks, if we just rely on our memory, we tend to skew our memory. Meaning, if I'm an optimist by nature, I might take a view of this of, oh, I'm sure they'll come around when they're ready. It's just, the timing was right. Or if I'm a pessimist, it's, gosh, why do I suck so much? I can't ever get any business. No one ever. And you play these extreme versions of yourself, where a scorecard is going to look less at the emotional and look more at the numerical. And it might help you make a better decision about what you want to do with that information because you have data. So scorecarding is critical. I could probably give you a couple other examples of this one, but what questions does that create for you, Kathryn?
Well, I'm going to bring up our friend Todd Bookspan's wonderful tool, Win by Noon, because it is a scorecard to the max. So that's kind of what I think of when I think of scorecarding.
Mhm.
But I also we have a lot of different podcasts on this as well, because it's a lot of, are you focusing on the outcomes or the disciplines? What does all that look like? So please go back and check those out. But I think where this is also really good is a little bit what Michael talked about how you actually feel like it went versus how it went. Because there will be months that I'm like, man, we were so busy. And then it's like, wait, we took like half as many applications. Why was I busy? So it helps you analyze what's actually coming in versus just maybe a whole bunch of past clients called with questions about their servicing. And that's what made you feel busy, but that didn't really result in any loans. So those kind of things can be really helpful to look
Mm.
back on and just say, oh, or even compare year over year. So I'm going to add a fifth one, which is a review, because if you're not reviewing your scorecard, reviewing your plan, reviewing your playbook, then kind of what's the point if you're using a playbook from 20 years ago? It might be a little different today. So I think review is another one that makes sure you're looking at the stuff you're scorecarding, at the plans that you're making and adjusting those often.
Yeah, it's intuitive that you say that, probably because we've spent a lot of time doing this. But if I could give our audience the visual of a clock, and if we looked at the flow of these four in clockwise motion, you would see that at high noon we might have vision, at 3 o'clock we might have planning, at 6 o'clock we might have the playbook, and at 9 o'clock we'd have the scorecard. And I would argue that bringing that 9 o'clock back around to the noon is the review that completes the circle so that you can then repeat. And that is a cycle that I think all business leaders I've ever worked with embrace. So you're intuitively correct to insert review because that helps close the loop. That now makes that an ecosystem in which everything you're doing comes back around, because at some point, as you've executed, you've cast vision, you've created a plan, you've started to document it in a playbook, and you're tracking your results. It's really critical now to say, okay, that now informs my vision, which means I can see the future a little more clearly now because I've made progress toward it. Just like any
Mhm.
journey we take in real life, as you move toward your destination, you start to see it more clearly, which then upgrades the next phase of your plan, which now maybe upgrades some of the standards in your playbook, which now creates different results in your scorecard, which feed the review for that cycle to repeat again. So very intuitive of you to point that out, and I think absolutely appropriate for our audience if they're trying to think about this as a system they can follow rather than just a individual or unique set of ideas. These are designed to flow.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully that helps give people that whole overview of the whole process so that they can start to pick through those podcast episodes and say, this fits in here and break those down. We'll maybe try to do that a little bit for you as well. Michael, is there anything else to add before we close out on business building foundation?
Well, this is where my mind goes with it, Kathryn, and it's certainly an appropriate time to say this. If you're coming into the fall of 2026, at some point you'll be listening to this episode and thinking, okay, if I'm going to embrace this flow and these, four foundational pieces, where do I start, and when do I start? And I would make the argument that it's really always a good time to dive into this flow. So if in fact you haven't thought about your vision, and here's the easy litmus test for it, and then I'll leave you with this. If the last time you documented the vision that you were sharing with others, whether they were teammates or strategic partners or customers, if the last time you documented that, you were to pull that out today and read it, and it's telling a story, is that story of the past, the present, or the future? If the story it's telling is of the past, that means you didn't close the loop. You didn't come around and recast your vision based on the information. You just had a great vision at one point in time and you didn't move it forward. It might be time for you to do that. If it's in the present tense, meaning you read it and you're like, oh wow, we're literally doing what I talked about 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whenever I documented this, congratulations. That means that you were really disciplined to drive toward the very things you had. And I hope you can take a moment and pause and celebrate that, because very few business owners do that. They tend to always, think, well, there's more I could be doing. And in this case, if you're literally living in the present of what you wrote, think of how incredible and powerful that is, that you foresaw what was going to happen, and now it's happening. Again, time to recast, but at least the urgency there is it's time right now. You're not behind. It's appropriate. And if it's still future, then I think you could look through these other three steps and just ask yourself, okay, that future is still compelling. We're not anywhere near that yet, but is it time to level up and draft a new plan? Is it time to update your playbook? Is it time to revisit your scorecard, review those results? Those are the questions I would ask. But for most of us, look at the vision that you've documented, past, present, or future. And my goodness, if you've never documented it at all, please take the opportunity this fall to get those thoughts out of your head and onto paper so you can lead others toward a better future.
And I'm not going to let this episode end without bringing up the Building Champions experience coming up in the fall. Check it out on their website. If you haven't already heard our episode on that, check that out as well. All right. So with that, I'm going to close out this episode of Building Bigger Lives. Thanks so much for joining us again. Hope this episode helps you and your business. Check us out on all the places. Please listen, please share, please rate us. We appreciate you listening.